Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed your little mini winter break due to the bad weather. If you're watching this in future years, hopefully you got some bad weather days too. We are going to go ahead and move forward. I feel like it's been, months since we have met and had a lesson, but we are going to go ahead and move ahead with our next evolution unit or evolution lesson, which is going to be macroevolution. Now I want to go ahead and start by saying that so far what we've covered is really kind of not debatable. It's really not touchy. It doesn't really offend anyone because if you remember, microevolution were those small changes, and we can see this in our lifetime. We've seen these changes to allele frequencies happen in other populations and even in our own population. Now, the reason evolution is sometimes controversial is because of the larger scale, and that's what we're going to be covering today is macroevolution. And so I just want to remind you that never in this class am I or your other teachers going to be trying to persuade you to believe in a certain way. Remember that you are in a biology class, specifically a college-level biology class, and so in this class we will be covering the scientific aspect. Now, I'm not saying you have to believe these larger scale changes. Really, the controversy, in my opinion, is really about how did we get here? And obviously, your religion may have an answer to that, and then biology has an answer to that. And so we're going to be looking at the biological answer to that. We're not going to go into great detail about origin, but to me, that's where most of the controversy lies. So you are more than welcome to maintain your own beliefs about how we got here and origin, but we are going to talk about some of the processes that led to new species on the biological side. And so you don't have to accept it, but I do need you to be familiar with the concepts. And then over the next few days, you're going to be doing an activity about the geologic time scale. Once again, that's according to biology. You can take it or leave it in your personal life. So I just don't want you to ever feel like anyone's trying to tell you what you need to believe. We are simply teaching you what biology says, okay? So what is macroevolution? Well, macro is the larger scale evolutionary changes. A lot of times when people think about evolution, they think about organisms turning into something else, and even that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is speciation. And so before we looked at small changes in allele frequencies, and here we're looking at actually the formation of new species. It doesn't mean it's something completely new and different. It just simply means that a new species arises. Now, in order to understand this concept, you really need to understand what a species is. And so a species is a group of the same organisms, and they're a population. But the key to being the same species is they have to be able to essentially mate or interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. There are instances where two different populations could potentially mate, but if they don't actually produce babies that can produce babies and keep those generations going, we would not consider them the same species. And so the key is reproduction, or really successful reproduction, and babies that can reproduce. And so when you're looking at a species, they do have the most similarities. When we talked about homologies or homologous structures in our evidence lab, in our evidence notes, we learned that homologies are due to common ancestry. And so you cannot get any more alike than being the same species. And so they're going to have both internal characteristics in terms of molecules and organs and cells, but they're also going to have external characteristics that are similar because their DNA is so similar. They have the highest level of DNA alignment. So two organisms within in the same species are going to have the most similar DNA to each other. Now, it won't be identical because remember we have variation, but their DNA will be more similar than two different species. And so they're going to share both physical characteristics as well as behaviors, and these are going to help them lead to successful reproduction. And so in order for new species to arise, there has to become a point where two populations are formed from an original. So we have an original species that is going to diverge into 2 new species. And once again, this doesn't always have to be something that is completely different. It could be one population of birds diverging to become 2 population of birds. They may still look very similar, but the key is reproduction, okay? Now, later on in the notes, we're going to look at a term called convergent. Converge means to come together, diverge means to move apart. And so divergent evolution is when a group or a species is going to become more and more different over time, to the point at which either it's impossible for them to mate or it's not likely for them to mate and produce viable offspring. And so they're going to become more different over time. Now we have 2 major types of this speciation or divergent evolution, and they are allopatric and sympatric. Now the key to allopatric is that you have a physical barrier or you have geological or geographical isolation or barriers. Something is going to physically separate 2 groups, okay? It could be due to the continent shifting, like we saw with Pangea, splitting up into the continents we see today. It could be mountain formation, it could be river formation, it could be changes in sea level, where a pond becomes divided or an ocean becomes divided in certain areas. There's a lot of different things that could cause this geographic isolation. There's an example with the Grand Canyon, where you had a population of ground squirrels that once that large canyon formed, you had a population on one side and a population on the other side, and over time they became more and more different. And so what happens is when they're no longer geographically together, when they are physically separated and become discontinuous, what happens is that gene flow, those alleles, are not going to move around as much. And so what happens is as they adapt to their new environment, they will become more different. And so depending on the environmental conditions, depending on the food and the resources in those areas, once they're separated, it could lead to natural selection favoring different traits. And so over time, they become more and more different. They may still look somewhat similar, but they become different enough that if you were to bring them back together, they're not going to mate anymore. Because over time, different traits are favored. So once again, the key to allopatric is that you do have a geographic isolation event or some kind of barrier that separates the 2. And then the other type of speciation is going to be sympatric. And this is where you don't have an isolation event. Essentially, they are still living together in the same place. They are not physically separated, but for whatever reason, you could see these groups diverging into new species. Now, it could be because of a different habitat. Maybe some choose the upper portion of the tree and others prefer the lower portion of the tree. They don't have a physical barrier. They're just kind of choosing to kind of maybe feed or live or eat or whatever in that particular microhabitat. It could be different food sources. This could happen with disruptive selection, so where you had maybe 2 extremes within the population. If they are favored over time, they may kind of prefer their own little micro habits, or kind of just prefer to mate within their phenotype. And so this may happen quickly sometimes. It's a little bit different than the physical barrier having to form. And you can especially see this sympatric happening very quickly in plant populations. And that's because of an issue called polyploidy. Now, we don't really see this in animals because if animals become polyploid, they typically don't survive. But during meiosis, whenever we're forming our gametes, if they don't have a proper separation, what can happen is you end up with extra sets of chromosomes. And we're not talking like 1 or 2, we're talking about whole sets. So, if your diploid number was 20, you could end up with a triploid, which is 30, or you could end up with a tetraploid, which is 40. Now, like I said, in animals, this doesn't lead to survival, but in plants, what can happen is that through just random mutation or random error in meiosis, they could produce a plant that is polyploid. And sometimes in plants, polyploidy leads to bigger, better, and stronger. And so what happens is within a very short period of time, or just through simple error in meiosis, you get a plant that has a different chromosome number. And if that plant can self-pollinate, what it will do is in a very short number of generations, you'll see a new species created. You'll see a new plant with a completely different chromosome number from the original parent plant. So this isn't common in animals, but it is quite common in plants. And this would be an example of kind of some fast evolution where it can happen within a few generations. So to kind of summarize though, big ideas, we have two major types of speciation. The key to allopatric is you have some type of physical barrier, like here they were separated by a river, and in sympatric, it's going to be some other reason. Okay, same thing with the fish. In allopatric, there was a physical barrier that separated the two, and then in sympatric, there's some other reason that led to them being two different new species. Now, some other things that are going to contribute to the speciation, and these kind of go along with allopatric and sympatric, is reproductive isolation. Once again, the key to speciation is you have a population that diverges and they get to the point where they will no longer mate and produce viable offspring. It could be because they can't, or it could be because they won't. And so what we're going to see are some different things that could lead to this reproductive isolation. Why would these two groups no longer mate? And so that's essentially the point at which speciation will happen, is once reproductive isolation becomes apparent, the two groups will no longer mate together. In this case over here, you see they were separated based on food source. After many generations, they would tend to mate with the similar flies that have the same food source. That is an example of speciation. It doesn't have to be major dramatic changes. It can be just simply a change in food source. And so we're going to take a look at two different types of barriers that could lead to reproductive isolation. And we do need to understand a little bit of vocabulary here. We have prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. Now we need to understand what this word means here. What is a zygote? Okay, so just as a quick reminder, a zygote is a fertilized egg. It's the very first cell that is created that is going to give rise to a new organism, okay, in sexual reproduction. So the sperm meets the egg, and once they're together, that forms a zygote. And that zygote is what will become the new offspring, okay? So when we say prezygotic, that means before the zygote. So something is going to cause an issue with reproduction before the zygote is formed, or we can have a postzygotic barrier, which means a zygote is created, egg and sperm come together, but something is going to happen after that. Either we won't see development completed, or there's going to be an issue with reproduction along the offspring lines. Okay, so we're going to start with prezygotic barriers. These are things that would prevent a zygote from forming. So it could be a habitat issue. Like I mentioned earlier, maybe one set of birds feeds in the upper portion of the tree and another species feeds in the lower portion of the tree. Or maybe you have one organism that lives in the water and one organism that lives on the sand. Okay, and so it could be just an issue with they have different habitats. Behavioral isolation is when they don't recognize mating calls. And I've always given this example, but back when I was in college, a long time ago, when I was in ecology class, one of the things I had to do for a lab was memorize frog calls. And I had a cassette tape, because remember that I'm old, I had a cassette tape that I would play at night, and I would listen to the frog calls, and then on a test, he would play the frog call, and we'd have to identify the species of frog. And so here's the thing with behavioral isolation. When it comes to sexual reproduction, a lot of times remember that there is selection. The females choose the males based on some kind of behavior or display or something along those lines. And so it could be that the females don't recognize the calls or they don't recognize the dance. So for whatever reason, there's a breakdown in the two groups where they don't recognize the mating calls and therefore they won't mate. Okay, so that would be behavioral isolation. Temporal is a time thing. Maybe they mate at different times or they breed at different times or different seasons. Mechanical is a parts problem. This is where the male part and the female part are not compatible. It doesn't just mean animals and sexual intercourse. It could also mean something like the plant parts. Okay, remember plants have male and female parts as well. And so mechanical isolation would be where the parts don't work, and so they physically would not be able to create an offspring or a zygote. And then the last one is where, for whatever reason, the gametes aren't compatible. So let's say they were able to do sexual reproduction, intercourse, whatever that may be. If the sperm cannot physically fuse and penetrate the egg to form a zygote, then there would be an issue there. So all of these would prevent an actual zygote from forming, and therefore two species would not be considered the same species if they were not able to produce that zygote. So here's some examples. You got a snake in the water, you got a snake on land, that would be habitat. Temporal, they mate in different seasons. Maybe one is fall, one is spring. I'm not really sure the specific one here. Behavioral is about mating calls or mating signals and not recognizing them in the other species. Mechanical is a parts problem. The male can't specifically, move the sperm to the female due to an issue with mechanical parts. And then gametic is where the gametes aren't compatible, so the sperm cannot fertilize the egg, even if they were able to come into contact with each other. And then our next set of barriers are going to be the post-zygotic. So remember, this is where something's going to happen after the zygote is formed. And so the first one is reduced hybrid viability. Now, a hybrid is when you cross two species. And so this is where you have two different species. Let's say they were able to mate and they were able to produce a zygote, but for whatever reason, somewhere in the development, that zygote did not complete development. It died before it was actually able to become a living offspring, like out of the mom. It did not complete development. So something happened along the way. Maybe the chromosomes weren't compatible. Whatever it is, we get a zygote, but the zygote doesn't complete development. The next example is reduced hybrid fertility, and this is where we get a living offspring. The baby completes development, but the baby is sterile. Okay, and we see a very common example of this with the horse and the donkey creating a mule. When they get mules, mules are sterile. They cannot produce baby mules. Okay, and a lot of times when we as humans kind of step in and we cross different species to create these hybrids, a lot of times those babies are sterile and then they aren't able to continue that reproductive line. And so therefore, we would not consider them the same species. And then the last one takes it one generation further. So we get a baby, okay? The baby produces babies, but those hybrids are weak and are not able to produce good offspring. So it just takes it one generation further. So the way I kind of like to remember this is reduced hybrid viability, no baby. The zygote doesn't complete development. In reduced hybrid fertility, we get a baby, but the baby's sterile. And then in hybrid breakdown, we get babies that have babies, but those offspring are sterile or weak. And so it just takes it one step further. All right, so no matter what the reason, if you have two groups that either cannot form a zygote or the zygote can't complete development and become viable offspring generation after generation, we would not consider those two groups the same species. Now, sometimes what will happen is the two species may come back together, or you may have two species that are similar enough that they may continue mating and produce hybrids. When they do that, we call that a hybrid zone where they still kind of interact. But depending on the hybrids and their fitness, different things may be kind of, I guess, encouraged or favored in terms of evolution. So if you have weak hybrids in your hybrid zone, what's going to happen is over time, it's probably going to support further speciation. It's going to support more divergence and more separation to the point that they probably won't mate anymore. Now, if they are relatively stable and the hybrids are somewhat healthy, they may maintain that hybrid zone, and it may just kind of stay that way, and they'll technically different species, but they may still mate and produce hybrids within that stable hybrid zone. Or it could be that if certain barriers are removed, if they are able to produce healthy hybrids, once those barriers are removed, the two species could become one again. And so it really just depends on the fitness of your hybrids. So once again, if hybrids are weak, it's gonna favor divergence and further speciation. If the hybrids are strong and barriers are removed, it's going to probably encourage them to become one species again. Or if you have a stable environment, but the barriers are still in place, they may just kind of maintain that hybrid zone. All right, the last little bit of notes is just taking a look at some evolutionary patterns that go along with speciation, and just some of the things that we see like in the fossil record or in just nature today. And so we're going to start with adaptive radiation. And so the word here, radiation, I want you to think about the sun, okay? The key to adaptive radiation is we're going to have an original species, and then many different species will come from that original. Okay, so think about a sun, think about rays coming off of the sun. One gives rise to many. A single common ancestor is going to give rise to many new species. And we see this all throughout the fossil record. You're going to see this in the geologic time scale activity that you're doing. Essentially, according to evolution and biology and how do we get here, a lot of our major groups experienced adaptive radiations, like mammals or reptiles. Darwin's finches are a common example. So you had an original ancestral finch that lived on the continent of South America, and then as they became isolated on different islands, what would happen is their beaks would adapt. They would kind of have different survival based on their beak sizes and the seeds that were available. And so over time, notice we have this sunshine here. We get all of these different finches coming from that ancestral group. Okay, so the key to adaptive radiation is that one gives rise to many. All right, another pattern which we've already talked about back in ecology is coevolution. A lot of times we will see two different species or two different populations that are evolving in response to each other. We see that in those really close relationships like symbiosis or predator-prey. As the prey evolves, so does the predator. As the pollinator evolves, so does the flower, and vice versa. So that's another pattern that we can see. Another pattern of evolution is called convergent evolution. So earlier we mentioned divergent, which means to become more different. Convergent means to become more alike. Now, this is what produces analogous structures. Remember that analogous structures do not show common ancestry, okay? Analogous structures are alike because those organisms evolved them due to similar functions or similar environmental pressures, okay? So for example, wings. All wings have a similar structure because they're used for flight. It doesn't necessarily mean that that insect and that bird are closely related, but because they're using that part for the same thing, they have evolved similar characteristics. We see the same things in organisms that swim through the ocean. We see that kind of narrow front, kind of an aquadynamic type of body. We see similar coloration. Like in the ocean, you may see like a lighter belly and a darker top. The lighter belly blends in with the sand and the darker top blends in with the water. We see convergent evolution with camouflage. Organisms that live in the desert are going to have similar coloration because they're all adapting to sand. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're related. And so convergent evolution is just when organisms become more alike due to function or pressure. It doesn't necessarily show that they are closely related. In fact, this dolphin down here is more closely related to you than it is this shark here, because that dolphin is a mammal. And so just because they look alike does not always mean that they are closely related. All right, the last pattern that we're going to look at is some different rates of speciation. We have gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. The rate at which evolution happens usually depends on the state of the environment. If the environment is relatively stable, then that change is probably going to be slow and steady over long periods of time. If it's unstable and we see abrupt environmental changes, what's going to happen is we'll see sudden changes in the populations. A lot of times punctuated equilibrium will be seen like after a major mass extinction or something like that, where there was a major change and then they have to kind of either adapt quickly or die. So both of these are seen in the fossil record. So like here you see slow and steady over time. Here you see kind of some abrupt changes. Something probably major happened in the environment whenever those changes occurred. Same thing over here in the shells. We see kind of slow and steady changes over time, or we see kind of a very quick change over a small number of generations. And then the very last thing that I want to talk about in this set of notes is a little bit about Earth history. Once again, not trying to tell you what you need to believe about how we got here, but according to biologists and according to evolutionists, everything descended from common ancestors billions of years ago, okay? So over the next couple of days, you're going to be taking a look at a geologic time scale, kind of learning how to read it, kind of learning about some of these evolutionary patterns. It does not have to change what you believe in any form or fashion, but I do want you to be familiar with the kind of geologic time scale. And so according to geologists, Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, okay? The first life was believed to have arisen about 3 billion years ago, with the first life being prokaryotes. And then over time, we kind of have this steady change in the living organisms from the beginning to now. And the way it's set up is you have the geologic time scale. It's such a long period of time that we have it divided into different either eons or eras, periods, epochs. You can see these up here. You can see where we are today, all right? So these numbers represent millions of years ago. So we are currently in the Cenozoic area, in the Quaternary period, in the Holocene epoch. And so that's kind of how you read the chart. This tells you how long ago it was. And so really what's recorded in the geologic time scale are a lot of major events, like the formation of the planet. When it first formed, it was fiery and volcanic. It had to cool, water had to form. We had to see photosynthesis and oxygen produced. We see the beginnings of all major life forms, like where did the first plants arise? Where did the first reptiles arise? Where did the first humans arise? And then another thing that you'll see are the major mass extinctions. There's believed to be 5 major mass extinctions that have occurred, and all of those have given rise to a lot of diversity after the extinction, kind of like that punctuated equilibrium and adaptive radiations like we just saw. And so over the next couple of days, you're going to be spending some time taking a look at the geologic time scale. You're not going to have to memorize any particular information on there and know specific dates or anything like that, but I do want you to be familiar with how to read it and how it works. At some point down the line, we will take a quiz over this set of notes, and we'll give you more information on that later. But I'm glad you guys are back in school. Hope you guys are doing well, and hopefully I will see you soon. If you have any questions, just let me know and email me. Y'all have a great one.